warm. It's a real honor to open today's proceedings. So the reflections that I'm going to offer you today about colonial medicine come from a project that I've been engaged in for the past few years, which is compiling a primary source collection on health, disease, and empire for Routledge, publisher. And it's going to form part of a much larger suite of online historical resources, all related to the British Empire in the long 19th century. So I've taken on the health theme, and the brief that they gave me was to compile about 1,000 pages worth of sources, to focus on printed sources, so nothing handwritten, nothing archival, and to focus on sources in the English language. That still left me with several 100,000 pages to sift through, so not much in terms of limitations. And I'd like today to try to give those sources a bit of an airing and to give you some reflections on what I think they say about colonial medicine, and particularly the prospects that practitioners had to do medical research in the colonies. I did want to focus on practitioners in this talk because when Mike invited me, he mentioned that this Congress really brings together lots of practitioners or former practitioners with an interest in medical history. And it occurred to me that practitioners have been a little bit sidelined in the historiography to do with colonial medicine. Okay, not necessarily in this space, but I work in an alternate dimension, academic medical history, where practitioners don't feature as much. They also don't think the 19th century is very fashionable, so I'm enjoying my visit to your planet quite a lot. This feels like my space. The kind of academic orientation about colonial medicine is very focused on the kind of politics around the creation of medical knowledge. I think Anna spoke about that yesterday in her keynote. It's very much about the power imbalances or the power dynamics that prevailed in colonial settings. And that scholarly focus has meant it's sometimes hard to take at face value what practitioners were saying about what they were doing in their own time. We now assume that they were doing lots of other things, that they were motivated by lots of extra medical factors as well. So this kind of gap between rhetoric or contemporary rhetoric and current interpretations is maybe a good place to start. So I want to open up with a few quotes to show how imperial medicine was being sold during the 19th century. Okay, so this is very low-hanging fruit. This is from Rudyard Kipling's famous, maybe infamous poem, The White Man's Burden. It was originally written for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. And in it, he describes the duties or the burdens that white imperialists should assume towards their colonized subjects. And he's very insulting towards indigenous peoples. Earlier in the poem, he calls them half devils, half children. Okay, so that's the kind of tone of it. And then midway through, he has this stanza that specifically alludes to medicine. And it goes, "Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease." Now, if you know anything about colonial wars, colonial epidemics, and colonial famines, this might raise a few eyebrows because we know often imperialists are implicated in causing these problems rather than solving them. But nonetheless, this idea was pertinent in the 19th century, and this was specifically cited in another often quoted source related to colonial medicine. So this is from a speech that was delivered by the Viceroy of India, George Curzon, in 1899. And he was addressing the annual meeting of the Lady Dufferin Fund, which was founded by Queen Victoria to improve the health of women in India. And that means native women in India. So Curzon wanted to herald the achievements of British medicine in the country, and he was talking to a mixed audience, so it comprised Indians as well as British colonists, and he referred to the spread of medical science as being one of the great boons or gifts of empire. So he said, I say this, that if we had come back to you from the West with our medicine in our hand, and with that alone, we should have been justified in our return. This part, at any rate, of the white man's burden, this portion of the bounty of the Aryan of the West, has not been ignored by the British. In my view, every hospital that we build in this country, every doctor that we train, every nurse that we turn out, every patient that we cure is a part of the service that we owe, and it is an element of our duty in this country, is a part of the homecoming gift which the Aryans of the West have brought back to their kith and kin. So these references to the Aryans is a bit of late Victorian racial theory that posited that the Indians and the British had shared racial ancestry, so they're both Aryan peoples, but this is not a relation of equals, right? Because in Curzon's framing, the British have an opportunity to sort of go govern the Indians and to bring their medicine to them. It's not just one of the aims of empire here, it's actually a justification for it, right? We are bringing you our medicine, so we are justified in coming to govern you, to share this with you. So Curzon is a politician, Kipling's a writer, neither are practitioners, and it is a little bit hard to find this kind of sentiment coming from practitioners themselves. But I did find one example from earlier in the century which shows the seeds of these ideas coming into place. So this is from the Medical Quarterly Review. It's a British medical journal. And in 1837, they were writing about the foundation of the Medical and Physical Society of Calcutta. So that's a society that's bringing together British practitioners who are interested in science and medicine. And they think this is a great development. This shows the transmission of scientific and medical knowledge to India that Curzon was later to praise. And I apologize for the dated and, quite frankly, offensive language in this quote, but it does show the mindset that they were bringing to this. So they say that the course of modern events is gratifying. They show us that intellect is not only the parent of power, but the sister of benevolence. And if the victorious arms of Europe have commenced by destroying, they have ended by renovating. If the Western scepter has sometimes sorely bruised its dusky subjects, yet, like the fabled arrows of the old mythology, it can cure the wounds which it inflicts. Okay, so this kind of shows the tension of this narrative, right? That there's a kind of inherent contradiction here. The British want to be thanked for bringing their medicine, for curing wounds, but they also acknowledge that they cause a lot of those injuries. Okay, so whether or not they should be thanked for this is, I think, a bit up for debate. And we can sort of still see versions of this today when we think about the provision of humanitarian aid to disadvantaged parts of the world, which are often making up for some of the social and financial devastation that was one of the legacies of empire, right? So we all have kind of versions of this. This questioning of myths, this flipping of narratives, this globalizing of medical history has largely informed the scholarship that historians have produced on colonial medicine since it really took off as a field in the 1980s. Now, this is part of that whole social turn in the history of medicine that Anna spoke about yesterday, so I won't go into it. But it's safe to say this is about the kind of the politics of medical provisions. So historians don't take for granted that medicine was a great gift of empire. It was all altruistic, humanitarian, charitable. It's all for the good of colonial subjects. Instead, they've been asking questions like this. What is colonial about colonial medicine? Or what makes medicine colonial rather than just medicine? And in response, historians have thought about ways in which medicine could serve an imperial agenda. So they've looked at, for example, how medicine could be a handmaiden of empire or a tool of empire, whether by ensuring the survival of Europeans in climates where they were otherwise going to be struck down by disease. They've looked at how public health measures during epidemics could be used as a means of social control or population control to subdue unrest. They've looked at how quarantine measures, again, a kind of epidemic measure, to quell the spread of disease could also be used as a tool to control global commerce. So these are some of the kind of texts, foundational texts in this discipline, which lay out some of those claims if you're interested in following them up. I think these kinds of questions, these kinds of issues are very important for historians to consider. And certainly they were guiding me as I was trying to figure out what to include in my collection, my primary source collection, and what to leave out. And they're very important for understanding the context in which colonial practitioners were working. That said, I think these questions are also somewhat limiting because they direct our attention away to some of the kind of more basic, workmanlike, daily practice that medical personnel in the colonies were performing, simply because that material doesn't appear colonial enough. And there's lots and lots of that kind of material. So before delving into the sources, I just thought I'd give you a little overview of the kind of material I've been using, some of which will be familiar to some of you. So first and foremost, I've been looking at lots of books, or what used to be called treatises, so from all around the world. These were written by practitioners who wrote about the diseases that they encountered in the places where they were stationed. They wrote about the treatments that they had tried. They wrote about their sense of the sanitary condition of these places. They wrote about all aspects of medical topography, so how climatic or environmental factors shape the disease profile of these settings. Sometimes these were texts about single epidemics, sometimes about single diseases, sometimes they were just general guides about how to survive in what we would now consider tropical climates, what were historically just called kind of warm climates. And there were a few hundred of these. They come from all across the world. I really felt it was important to represent the breadth of empire in my collection, although the bulk of material actually comes from India, the West Indies, and the coasts of Africa. But I still think it was kind of important to represent places that we don't necessarily think of in this context, of places like Ireland, the Pacific, my own home country of Canada is going to be in there. So it is possible to think about empire much more broadly than the scholarship has done so far. The second type of source I looked at very systematically, and which has been taking the bulk of my time, is going through medical journals. There are lots of them. Some of them will be very familiar to you. The BMJ, the Lancet, still going strong. Some of them much more short-lived titles, the Medical and Physical Journal or the Medico-Surgical Journal, which I'm going to be talking about in a bit. There are lots of colonial journals as well. The Indian Medical Gazette, the South African Medical Journal. The contents of those journals is more obviously colonial than a lot of the British material. And what I found kind of striking was how marginalized colonial medicine was in some of the 19th century British journals. They're not that interested in what's going on far away. And it's actually quite hard to convey that sense of neglect or the kind of the silences and absences in the record when you're putting together a primary source collection, because you have to think about what to include, and it's hard to sort of explain that this material was sometimes very rare. Sometimes, these articles are very few and far between. So that was kind of one of the challenges, I think, of thinking or trying to contextualize the way medical research was received from the colonies. I also looked at newspapers, of course. Newspapers do talk about big events like epidemics. As we all know, those things generate headlines. But I think the richest source of material on colonial medicine, and some of you will be familiar with these, government reports, sometimes called the blue books. They've got blue covers. These basically really take off in the 1820s, 1830s, and they compile lots of information that are gathered in the course of government inquiries or parliamentary inquiries into major outbreaks of disease. This is one of the most famous ones. So it's the Royal Commission on the Sanitary State of the Army in India. It's a post-mutiny work that was very interested in uncovering the causes of mortality in the British Army in India. This was as a result of very spectacular statistics that were suggesting that the entire British force in India had to be renewed every decade because there were so many deaths in the service. Although that statistic was challenged in this report, but this was the kind of popular conception going into this period. And hard to convey the size of these things. So these are about 500, they're 2 volumes, 500 odd pages apiece. They're very, very long, very definitive. And the reason they're so long is that they put all the information that the commission gathered in front of the reader. So you have witness statements, you have interviews, you have responses to circulars, you have tables and tables and tables of data, morbidity, mortality statistics from every region in the country. You have lots and lots of graphs of meteorological conditions. You have aggregate summaries from different areas, and you have final recommendations. So these, there's a lot of information on these epidemics. And picking out what extract to choose from these is often very, very tricky. This kind of government reporting really only takes off, as I mentioned, a few decades into the 19th century. But I wanted to look at a slightly earlier period for the kind of meat of this talk, and to look at how medical research was framed earlier in the 19th century. And I'm saying kind of research in a somewhat anachronistic way. I'm really just kind of loosely talking about the attempt to generate new knowledge about health and disease. And one would think that colonial practitioners would be ideally positioned to do this. They're faced with lots of diseases that weren't available for observation in Britain. But, as I'm going to show, they faced actually a lot of hostility from metropolitan practitioners who didn't like the idea that colonial practitioners were trying to redefine some ideas about disease causation. So I'm going to give you a few examples, which are all to do with yellow fever and how it was reported in the medical press. So in the opening years of the 19th century, there was a very fierce debate raging in journals like the Medical Physical Journal about the contagiousness of yellow fever. So this is one of the London journals, and its editors were explicitly seeking out information from all around the world about medical topics. And although they kept assuring their readers that they weren't interested in debates that only left each side more attached to their original position, so they kind of had a very early acknowledgement of confirmation bias, actually their journal was just full of people fighting with each other over these issues. The question of whether yellow fever was or wasn't contagious was exactly the kind of bitterly contested issue that medical press thrived on. So yellow fever at this time is at its deadliest peak. It infamously killed over 80% of the expeditionary force that Napoleon had sent to Haiti in 1804. It was generally seen as endemic to warm climates, but a lot of confusion or uncertainty about its mode of transmission really occurred after it wound its way as far north as Philadelphia in an epidemic in 1793. And even if yellow fever might still have been seen as a remote threat for people in Britain, what was at stake in these debates about the causes of disease was more than just a knowledge of this kind of particular kind of tropical illness, but the very principles of medical investigation and reporting. Could eyewitnesses be trusted? Could the evidence from one epidemic be extrapolated and applied to another? How could contradictory theories both claim to be empirically grounded? And how were medical practitioners in Britain meant to weigh competing claims that emerged from the colonies? So for armchair commentators in Britain, they absolutely saw themselves as the final arbitrators of developments that were unfolding abroad. And they sought, in some cases, to reduce the role of colonial practitioners to being merely their eyes and ears on the ground. They constantly questioned their competence as theorists, as well as their right to theorize at all. The literal distance between the metropole and the peripheries thus also marked a professional chasm. Observations about colonial epidemics could only be made in situ, but their true nature was often pronounced on an ocean away by people who had never seen them. As I mentioned, historians have long been asking what was colonial about colonial medicine, but how colonial medicine served medicine or the medical profession is a slightly different question, and one that, that practitioners themselves took very seriously. So in 1805, the Jamaican-based physician Thomas Dancer, he expressed in the Medical and Physical Journal a hope that his ideas about yellow fever would not only be received without prejudice, but also apart from all other matters with which it is concerned. And here he explicitly flagged the quarantine debate. Okay, so for those of you who have not spent the past few years reading thousands of pages about this, there are two positions on quarantine. Contagionists believe that sick people can transmit diseases across time and space, and anti-contagionists believed that diseases were endemic to particular places, so you could only get sick in those places, and if a sick person moved away from them, they couldn't carry the disease with them. Okay, so contagionists believe in the value of quarantine, anti-contagionists thought it was unnecessary. Okay, quick summary there, but that's kind of what's behind this. Dancer doesn't want this question muddying the waters. He only wants to understand how the disease works. Dancer wanted nuance in the contagion debate. He said that different types of fever didn't exist in the same seasons and situations. They didn't run the same course. They didn't have the same terminations. So he thought every fever needed to be understood on a case-to-case basis. And that approach, of course, favors direct observation. His own contention that the yellow fever outbreak in Jamaica, which had just killed 90 soldiers stationed there, he believed it was contagious based on what he said, facts that are known by every practitioner on this island. And he gave some evidence. He said that sailors who've taken ill at plantations have communicated the yellow fever back to bookkeepers and overseers when they came in for lodging and refreshments. He also included a supportive note from his colleague stationed at the military hospital at Up Park Camp in Jamaica, who attested that the yellow fever that had raged there had no obvious local cause and had been transmitted through the battalion from the sick to the healthy. And Dancer concludes with this flourish. This kind of thing is very common in this period. So he goes, to deny that the plague is contagious is to be guilty of a libel on the common sense and veracity of mankind, and to shake the foundation of all human testimony. Why would anyone try to refute direct testimony? He's basically saying it's only out of some kind of contrarian impulse, for the desire of being distinguished for superior and original thinking. What will it not tempt to who court not the truth, but public fame? So Dancer's use of the word testimony with its kind of courtroom resonance, something I'm going to come back to. But I want to kind of switch to the response to this piece to show how the dynamics of the transnational contagion debate could operate. So immediately a response comes from a guy called Thomas Alder. He feels personally slighted by the implication that he's chasing fame and not the truth. He's a noted anti-contagionist. He wrote this book in 1805. He got very carried away with his fonts, as you can see. But somewhere in there you can see the impropriety of considering fevers as arising from contagions, anti-contagionist. And in his reply to Dancer, he obviously can't summon up any first-hand evidence to refute that the particular epidemic that had just hit Jamaica was contagious, but nonetheless felt emboldened to reinterpret events from abroad. So the fact that Dancer said there was no local cause, not a problem. Alder looks at a map and he realizes that Jamaica is not too far from San Domingo, and he decides it's possible that winds from San Domingo, which everyone knows is a source of putrefaction, could have brought the disease over to Jamaica some 50 or 100 miles away. Furthermore, and then he goes into this kind of anecdote he's heard. So he goes, furthermore, he's heard from an unnamed gentleman of veracity that in 1799 in the West Indies, he goes, I think in Jamaica, that a regiment was seized with yellow fever after taking too much hard exercise and rum. And again, he's a bit fuzzy on the details. He said, I think they were inured to the climate. And that this intemperate behavior would have made them particularly susceptible to even the slightest whiff of disease coming on the breeze from San Domingo. Okay, so this is too much for David Brown. He's the military surgeon in Jamaica. He writes back to the journal saying that Alder's preposterous for thinking that that disease can be borne on the wings of the wind across the ocean from San Domingo to Jamaica. Alder writes back, furious, makes no attempt to refute this point. He simply says that Dancer and Brown in Jamaica have been blinded by this injurious and absurd doctrine of contagion. So if the two doctors in Jamaica are motivated by their local concern, which is making sense of an epidemic that had killed 90 soldiers under their care, then Alder, of course, is a product of his circumstances. He's writing in Britain, and quarantine policy is at the forefront of his thoughts. We all know that quarantine is really about commerce, right? Britain's commercial fortunes. So his main motivation is to stop it being used and, as he puts it, destroying the nation. That's what he thinks is at stake here. That he had no first-hand experience of yellow fever was no barrier to him making pronouncements on its spread, nor as dismissing as blind doctrinarians those who did. So the challenge of turning medicine into an empirical, research-based discipline or science in this period, and many practitioners did want this, is really revealed in these debates, right? This is really challenging. First, because the contagion debate is irrevocably bound up in policy and dogma. Second problem is that the base of evidence, particularly about diseases like yellow fever, can only be obtained at a vast distance from the center of the medical establishment. So, of course, it's one thing to ask doctors to trust the evidence of their own eyes. It's quite another to just ask them to trust someone else's testimony. To maintain any degree of authority in these discussions, colonial doctors thus had to aspire to pure, unimpeachable empiricism. So this is James Johnson. He is author of The Influence of Tropical Climates on the European constitutions, first written in 1812, one of the kind of best-selling books on this topic in the 19th century. It goes through many, many editions. And in it, he wrote that it was very important to establish that all of his findings were based on, as he puts it, observation and personal suffering. He puts that in all caps. Okay, this is something we can all maybe empathize with, right? Our observations come from personal suffering. He was a naval surgeon in India, and he has direct experience with the diseases he's talking about. And he stresses to readers that he has been determined never to succumb to any doctrines or opinions, whatever might be their authorities, when they clashed with the evidence of his own senses. So when Johnson returns to Britain, he becomes the editor of the Medical Surgical Journal and becomes one of those authorities. He becomes a metropolitan critic. When it comes to the debate around contagion, he pleads for civility, but his journal nevertheless features quite a lot of partisan analysis of the dispatches that are coming through. So a case in point comes from the yellow fever outbreak in Gibraltar in 1828. This kills over 1,000 people, which was 5% of the population of that island. So a major epidemic. Britain sent a physician of the fleet, David Barry, to go investigate the causes of the outbreak. And Barry concludes that the disease was contagious and imported from a fever-ridden ship that had traveled from Havana, which had been improperly quarantined. So some sick sailors had been brought off the ship and brought on shore. By contrast, you have Hugh Fraser, who's the surgeon of the civil hospital in Gibraltar, really objects to this conclusion. He blamed local causes. So he thinks the disease was a result of impure drainage or problematic drainage. It's releasing noxious fumes, right, which is the anti-contagionist theory about how diseases are caused. And he's furious with Berry, so Berry publishes his findings in Britain, Fraser replies, Berry replies, etc. They get into this immense slugging match that transcends journals, multiple societies. They're writing separate tracts, they're writing politicians, they're absolutely duking it out and really insulting each other. They're impugning each other's witnesses. They're writing hundreds of pages about the evidence that they can muster to support their own views here. Both, of course, have direct experience of the epidemic, but Berry arrives a few months into it because he's sent from Britain, whereas Fraser basically says, I was a colonial doctor on the scene at the time. You can trust me to be led purely by the evidence of the facts. By contrast, he presents Berry as an outsider whose views could not be trusted and whose belief in quarantine and contagion must be self-interested or financially motivated. He can't figure out which or why. He has no evidence of this. Faced with these competing accounts and claims, James Johnson, who's, again, he's a journal editor, he's trying to mediate all this, he basically ignores all the evidence that both sides are presenting and simply falls back on doctrine. Okay, so Johnson sides with Fraser's anti-contagionism, citing his general distrust of the evidence that contagionists put forward. He thinks contagionism is simply a most unnatural and unfeasible doctrine that's every day losing ground in the opinion of those best qualified to form a correct as well as unbiased opinion on the subject. So this is coming from someone who had made his career on mistrusting authorities, but now just sees doctrine and other people's credibility as a way of resolving contentious issues. Okay, so observers have to be untainted by ideology, but critics are free to deploy it. And just as a kind of little side note, one of the other things that Berry and Fraser disagree on is whether yellow fever confers immunity. Berry says it does, and he institutes these immunity passports that allow people from Gibraltar to travel back to Britain. And there's a lot of interest in them a couple of years ago because they're sort of seen as a forerunner to the vaccine passports that got issued. So just a nice kind of little historical footnote there. Many colonial practitioners chose not to be mere transcribers of the weather or of case histories and directly delved into the contagion debate, showed that an explicit desire to research the causes of disease could still occur alongside claims of factual accuracy. Now, I know lots of you work on the Navy. I've worked on the Navy, and the Army does this too. They're absolutely the vanguard of those kinds of developments. And specifically, from the 18th century onwards, the Admiralty does encourage surgeons to write journals, to take notes on disease. Later in the 19th century, they specifically ask surgeons to seek out the causes of disease, to trace diseases to their source. Since ships were often identified as a vector by contagionists, naval authorities are very eager to put the blame anywhere else. So they really ask surgeons to try to take note of local factors, of meteorological conditions, anything other than the ship being a cause of transmitting disease. The Admiralty does publish a lot of these accounts once they start making annual reports in the 1830s, but some surgeons also prepare them separately for the medical press. They publish their own treatises. But not everyone welcomes this proliferation of testimony. So particularly there's objections that some of these surgeons aren't being terribly objective or descriptive. So case in point, 1831, there's an account by a Dr. McKinnell about the yellow fever outbreak on board the naval frigate Sybil. This occurs off the coast of Africa. And it's criticized, this account is criticized by a pseudonymized letter that's published in the London Medical and Physical Journal. And the author of this letter really takes issue with McKinnell's account. He says that this disease wasn't just caused by noxious emanations inside the vessel. Instead, he fails to provide the reader with any information about where the ship was docked, what other ships it encountered. This marks an egregious break in the chain of circumstances in the account, and says that any epidemic account that dabbles in theory can't be trusted as a source. And forgive the kind of long quote, but I think it makes this point really well. He says, when a medical man brings before the public the history of an epidemic in which he has been personally engaged with a view to elucidate the question of contagion, he stands before his professional brethren as a witness does in the presence of a jury in a court of justice. As long as he either details plain facts attested to by his senses, he's listened to with attention because he's furnishing the jury with the materials on which their verdict is to be founded. But when he offers his own inferences and speculations, he lays down the sacred office of a witness and takes up that of an advocate, and a shade of distrust is forthwith interposed. Right? So what he's saying in this formulation is that the best placed individual to determine the cause of an epidemic isn't the one who experienced it, but the professional colleagues who received their account. Right? So the colonial doctor, the naval surgeon, the direct observer, none of them have any business acting as independent researchers. Right? They're valuable as instruments or as kind of tools, as witnesses, but they're not the jury, right? They're not the judge. So I would suggest the 1830s kind of marks the sort of close of this kind of discourse, not because the contagion debate gets settled then, far from it, but because, as I noted, the way epidemics are reported on starts to change. So this is a move towards those big government reports. This happens with cholera's arrival in Britain in the early 1830s. That leads to a real realignment between colonial practitioners and metropolitan ones. It gives a real urgency to the information that Indian doctors were spreading about the earlier Indian outbreaks. So even The Lancet, a journal which is really unapologetically kind of London-based, has no interest in the outside world, even The Lancet starts publishing accounts coming from India at this point. Okay, this is one which is based on personal experience of the epidemic by a surgeon in the East India Company. So I think it's one thing, of course, to devalue experience in discussions of fevers that are so distant that they're essentially abstract, and quite another to dismiss it when there's, when these diseases are posing an immediate threat. Methods of recording epidemics also undergoing a shift. And particularly, it's kind of the rise of the statistic movement in Britain, which meant that epidemics are not understood through individual accounts, but rather through an accumulation of witness statements and aggregated data. And that's what's supposed to inform research from then on. But the authority of colonial doctors has certainly undergone a shift. They're now seen as more or less experts in the diseases of their own realms, even as some British commentators are always questioning whether the versions of cholera or typhoid that make it to Britain are the same ones that exist abroad. This skepticism and continued criticism encourages greater research autonomy abroad, as colonial practitioners ultimately establish their own medical schools, their own medical societies, and their own medical journals to communicate their findings to each other without worrying about their metropolitan reception. So you have journals like the Indian Medical Gazette, which could focus on cases from practice, just day-to-day encounters with anything from snake bites to dysentery, and they could build on working a research base that was by and for local practitioners. And I can assure you there is reams and reams of this stuff, which has largely been neglected by historians because, again, it simply constitutes quotidian research devoid of any explicit colonial framing or ideology. As one might expect, it loosely follows the trajectory of British medicine, so it moves from more qualitative accounts to more quantitative ones. It starts to employ chemical analysis of blood, of drugs, of other secretions. It starts to employ more instruments like microscopes. And because samples can be sent to Britain for further testing, there's more of a symbiosis between colonial doctors and metropolitan ones. They also paved the way for the foundation of tropical medicine at the close of the 19th century, which is a whole different story, but I'm sure you know it's this kind of groundbreaking investigations into parasitology. Tropical medicine, though, is so expensive that it requires a lot of government funding, involves huge laboratories, and involves large insect capture programs. And that means that its advocates, like its founders, Ronald Ross and Patrick Manson, have to be very explicit about the imperial and commercial benefits that result from a mastery of tropical diseases. So they are kind of explicitly engaging with these ideas around the value of colonial medicine and are tapping into those quotes we saw at the beginning. If anything, local practitioners had a much purer vision of what they were doing. They really saw each other's education as the prime motive for publishing their research. They're trying to make each other into better practitioners. I'm going to kind of skim over this one, but it's basically a dispatch from a physician who worked in Sierra Leone who's basically saying that practitioners who arrive have to treat diseases they've never seen before, of which they have no knowledge, of which they don't have any cures, and as a result, lots of patients are dying because of their ignorance, right? So he sees it as very important to share his expertise about these diseases, right? That's his motivation. This is very much so about the survival of Europeans. And it's worth keeping this in mind as we consider whether the kind of research that's being published in the Indian Medical Gazette constitutes colonial medicine or just medicine, and whether this distinction matters as long as the findings are sound. So certainly colonial practitioners rarely express any sense that their actions are serving a broader imperial agenda. And it's often the things that motivate research in any time or place. It's things like professional advancement, reputation, financial considerations, just curiosity, right? Opportunity. It was argued rarely expressed to share his expertise about these diseases, right? That's his motivation. This is very much so about the survival of Europeans. And it's worth keeping this in mind as we consider whether the kind of research that's being published in the Indian Medical Gazette constitutes colonial medicine or just medicine, and whether this distinction matters as long as the findings are sound. So certainly colonial practitioners rarely express any sense that their actions are serving a broader imperial agenda. And it's often the things that motivate research in any time or place. It's things like professional advancement, reputation, financial considerations, just curiosity, right? Opportunity. It was arguably a combination of these factors that led practitioners to write more specialized studies of the diseases that were endemic to where they were serving, even if they did affect the local population rather than colonists. So some of these diseases get recast as exotic, and by the second half of the 19th century, these regularly start to feature in both the colonial and British medical presses. Illnesses such as elephantiasis and leprosy were known in Europe, but began to be treated as tropical diseases, a process that pathologized huge parts of the globe. So as Nancy Steppen has argued, the physical deformation caused by elephantiasis encouraged Europeans to reproduce images that objectified colonial subjects, often featured in a state of full frontal nudity with prominent genital swellings on display. I've taken these images from the Wellcome Image Archive and have censored some of them, not out of prudery, but because there's a big debate in the profession about whether we should be reproducing these images and whether doing so replicates an imperial gaze that demeaned its subjects. When Europeans were depicted in these pictures, they're often anonymized, so their heads are cut off, and that's in contrast to the way that colonized subjects weren't. Other diseases that were new to European commentators helped to consolidate the idea that certain places were beset by an assortment of strange, dangerous, or disfiguring conditions. So research into things like the guinea worm or the Delhi sore could provide technically competent descriptions of these diseases and how they might be treated, but their names created an indelible association between places in India and Africa and disease. And this in turn means that the spread of British hygiene principles can be cast as one of the gifts of empire, even if it's not accompanied by any meaningful improvements to infrastructure. So part of the decolonizing of the medical research that emerged from these settings has involved renaming some diseases. which carried very pejorative associations. So the belly bore is leishmaniasis. So what does all this tell us? I am wrapping up now. First, that medical personnel in the colonies have always been active participants in trying to advance medical knowledge. They had opportunities to study disease across the globe and attempted to substantiate theories about their spread through direct observations that undoubtedly qualified them as researchers. However, we also know that they were in some ways confined by expectations. They were not always seen as legitimate contributors to medical discourse in Britain, and Britain remained the place where medical knowledge was ratified and disseminated. We know that they increasingly wrote for the benefit of each other, to other colonial doctors, and that they implicitly served imperial interests that would help European settlers to survive and thrive in the tropics. They never seemed to question their right to be in these places. We also know that they studied the diseases of native people or indigenous people, and they did so in ways that implicitly or explicitly reinforced the hierarchies between not only doctor and patient, which you might expect, but also between the colonizer and the colonized. Their research, however empirical and pure it strove to be, could never be entirely divorced from the circumstances that produced it, which should neither be, controversial or surprising. So having looked at many thousands of these sources, what I'm most struck by, I suppose, is the lack of attention paid to those grand claims made at the beginning of this talk, those quotes from Kipling and Curzon. Alongside their service to empire, colonial doctors were also and irrevocably engaged in the fight against disease. And I think our challenge as historians of medicine, on both sides of our discipline, is to properly acknowledge these two sides of the same coin. So, thank you.